Hi, it's Father John, and welcome to St. Mark the Evangelist Parish. I'd hope to have some theme music like the BBC, but instead, all you really have is me and Father Serge. And Father Serge has been with us through Lent, parts of Lent, and the beginning of Easter. And you know, the feast of St. Catherine of Siena, the great Dominican saint, is coming up. And so I asked Father Serge to tell us a few things over a series of a couple little conferences as to why you should be interested in Catherine of Siena as a saint. Father Serge, it's been great to have you at St. Mark's. I know you love St. Catherine of Siena. Would you tell us something about her?
Well, St. Catherine is unusual in that most of the saints of the Middle Ages are religious, and she's a layperson. And as a layperson, she becomes a good model for all of those who are trying to live a deeper life in the church. Her actual name was Caterina di Giacomo di Benincasa, in which she was born in Venice back in 1347. She was associated with the Dominican order as a tertiary. And as a tertiary, she gave herself not only to contemplation, but even more to living out that contemplation and acts of charity and mercy for others. And her spirituality then helps lay people understand how they can incorporate their spirituality into their everyday life, their lives of service and mercy.
Now, a tertiary is a layperson that's associated with
right.
the first order of a religious group. The
Right.
Franciscans, the Carmelites, they have third order or tertiary religious groups. And so, normally you don't hear a lot about the lay members of these religious groups, like you pointed out. So why is it that we know so much about St. Catherine of Siena?
Well, first of all, she was an unusual character. She got all kinds of people upset. Maybe that's the first thing you need to do to be famous. In fact, she was so eccentric in a sense that the Dominicans actually appointed a Dominican friar, Raymond of Capua, to investigate her and to keep her in line. Instead, she made him her disciple, trained him, as it were, to reform the Dominican order, and after her death, he became Master General of the Dominican order. So her influence was surprising. Everyone who would change Catherine was changed by Catherine.
Did St. Catherine ever write anything?
Her most famous book is called The Dialogue. She called it My Book. And the dialogue is basically a conversation between herself and God the Father. And I think she wrote it as a dialogue because she wanted each one of us, as we read it, to enter into that conversation. So we should be active readers. We should be joining in that conversation with her and God, and then learning to apply all that is going on to our own lives and our own situation.
So could you, for St. Mark parishioners, everybody else who might be listening, what is it she's trying to say in the dialogue? Does she have any major points or theme?
Well, there's a lot of things that's going on in the dialogue. That's why it's such a thick and sometimes complicated book. But if we want to simplify it, we might begin talking about the primary topic. And the topic is truth. And the reason truth is so important for her is that truth means existence, what is. So she's not talking about fairy tales and she's not talking about abstract things. She's talking about actual reality, God's love for us. So the theme is the truth of God's love for us, not truth in the abstract, but truth as something personal and intimate to each and every one of us, the truth that we are loved and that we are given the capacity to love God and our neighbor back in return.
And so how would she describe God's love as a real thing as opposed to simply an idea in my mind?
Well, for Catherine, God isn't at a distance from us. He's actively involved in everything we do. The reason we have so many problems in our lives is that we are so self-willed that we're constantly making ourselves, as it were, disruptive to his will for us. We're trying to do things our way, and what Catherine points out, if we really want peace, we have to do things God's way. And doing it God's way means we need to take God's will and make it our own will and be fully responsible for it.
Well, you said St. Catherine was kind of disruptive. That's why Raymond of Capua was sent by the Master General of the Order to kind of corral her into line. Well, so was that disruption? Was that God's will? Was she God's will? I mean, how do you know when it's God's will and when you're just being self-absorbed?
Well, I think there's several things. First of all, if it truly is for the good of the other person, and that's unique with Catherine. She always wanted the good of the other person. That was foremost in her mind. But remember, the good is nothing if it isn't true to begin with. So Catherine was constantly searching for the truth, and she was constantly trying to live out that truth in her acts of mercy and kindness and compassion.
So I know when we talked about this show, you said that you thought, if I understood correctly, that there were 4 major themes in the dialogues. Because I know we're going to explore those a little bit more over the rest of these sessions. But what are the 4 themes that you remember?
Okay, what Catherine is doing is she's asking God 4 things. And the whole dialogue is God's answer to her petitions. First, she petitions that she might understand how she can, as it were, grow in holiness. This is important because Catherine was one of those self-willed persons that almost nothing could stop. When we hear that, it usually makes us a little frightened and we think they're a little bit weird or domineering. Well, that could be true, but it can also lead a person to really give themselves uncompromisingly to God and His will, and especially to the needs of our neighbor. So Catherine, like some of my other great heroes, Saint Teresa of Avila, Mother Teresa of Calcutta, was strong-willed. You might even say they were stubborn. But all 3 learned to be stubborn for God and for the good of their neighbor. And that's what made them great saints.
So God's holiness, how do I be holy, was one of her the things that she talked about with the Father. What else did she talk about with
She talks in the same vein that now your strong will can be a hindrance to you because you can direct it to the wrong thing. So originally, Catherine was very focused on physical penance, almost as if doing this physical penance would make her holy. In her treatise on discretion, she immediately realizes, as God speaks to her, that holiness is not a matter of bodily penance. Bodily penance simply helps us put our unruly emotions back into line, but it doesn't make us holy. What makes us holy is humble love. Once my emotions no longer conflict with my work of love, then I can give myself totally to that work. And that's what's important. And I have to learn to make sure that when I am loving someone else, it's a matter of service, not a matter of domination. So it's not a matter of willfulness. It's a matter of seeking the true good of the other person with all that we are and willing to pay the price for attaining that good.
So how would Catherine know what was good for another person?
That comes through faith.
And so
Catherine is very intent upon good theology. What's important is that we understand what faith tells us about what it means to be good, and that we not only know it, but we put it into practice.
You know, there's a famous story about St. Catherine tending plague victims, and we're kind of in the middle of a plague right now. How do you see that story, if you tell our parishioners about it, how do you see that as an experience of her willing the good of another and the will of God?
Well, first of all, let's be honest. The Black Plague was a terrible, terrible thing. That anybody would go out and minister to other people in the Black Death was taking their own life in their hand. And so she's following Jesus, who died out of love for us. She then wants to die out of love for those people He has placed into our care. She's giving us an example of what this true love. It means seeking the good of the other person, even at sometimes a drastic cost to ourselves.
You know, as I remember the story, is as she's sopping the wounds of a person dying of the plague, she wrings it into a bowl, and she had such a desire to share with that man his suffering that she actually picked up and drank the bowl.
Yeah,
do you remember that? Is that a true story?
I'm not sure. That's a little gross. But if she did, what I suspect was happening is that's one of the ways she can use penance to keep herself humble.
I remember St. Francis, and apparently was a true story.
Kissing the feet of the leper.
Kissed the leper on the lips is what the one I heard. See all these rumors floating around.
Yeah.
Wish we had a Franciscan here. But the idea being is How is it that you, in a time of suffering, love another person? You help bear their burdens. And so in the next session, hopefully tomorrow, we're going to expand a little bit on the dialogues and some of the other things that St. Catherine talks about. So till then, say your prayers and say a prayer for Father Serge and I, because I think he's going to talk about the holiness of priests. And that part might be scary. So long.